Okay, so today for Southwest's Natural Sciences Seminar, we have Dr. Graham Lau, and he's going to talk to us about astrobiology and the search for life on Mars. So, Dr. Lau, thank you so much for being here with us today, and I appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule. So, would you like to talk a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Graham. I go online as the cosmobiologist. I have a collegiate background in biology and chemistry and astrophysics and a PhD in geology. My primary research focus was in geochemistry and mineralogy, specifically in remote environments here on Earth, in polar environments, in sulfur rich environments, and how we can use those to understand the potential for life on places like Mars, on Jupiter's moon Europa. And through my graduate studies and through my PhD, I found that I really like sharing science. And so a large part of my career now is also in communicating science, in working for a nonprofit called Blue Marble Space, which I currently do. I'm the director of communications and marketing for this nonprofit, as well as being a research scientist. And so I do a lot of work kind of in both realms, in research of astrobiology as well as in communicating astrobiology. I also host the show for NASA astrobiology called Ask an Astrobiologist. It's a monthly live stream show where other astrobiologists in a variety of fields come on the show, and we have a live stream conversation about their career, the things they did in their own careers to get to where they are as scientists, as well as about their research. And then we have a period where I open it up to the audience to ask any questions they have of these scientists about their careers and their work. Um, and then I also have my hands in a bunch of other pots as well. I also guide meditations. I'm also really into the philosophy of science, into thinking about futurism, where our civilization is going, whether or not we ever will find alien life out there. A lot of us who think about the potential for alien civilizations are also thinking about the potential for our own civilization and our own future. And so I've found that it's kind of fun to have a career where I do a whole bunch of different things.
Awesome. Well, we're super excited to have you here. I know the Mars rover Perseverance is very close to your heart. Would you like to talk a little bit about what that mission is about? What's going on? Why is it important?
Yeah, so I mean, Perseverance, it was known as Mars 2020. It was actually named by a high school student named Alex Mather. And the same thing for Ingenuity, which is a small helicopter that is now sitting by itself on the surface of Mars. It came off of the underbelly of the Perseverance rover, and is very soon, here this weekend or early next week, going to have its first test flight. Ingenuity was also named by a school student named Vanessa Rupani. And the student who named Perseverance is Alex Mather. And so I'm really glad that we do that now, that we allow students the opportunity to present potential names for our missions. The same thing happened with Curiosity, the other large rover that's currently working on Mars. Perseverance is cool for a lot of reasons. There's so many awesome things about the mission, fun little Easter eggs that have been dropped in by the engineers, but also for astrobiology. It's the very first mission since the Viking landers back in the 1970s to specifically be looking for signs of life on Mars. With the other rovers, with Sojourner, with Spirit and Opportunity, with Curiosity, we've had the potential of seeing signs of life in some form or another, at least understanding the chemistry and the geology that could be coming from signs of life. But with this new rover, with Perseverance, part of its mission is specifically to look for signs of life. And there's a few instruments on board that are really awesome for doing that. My favorite is called Sherlock. This is a deep UV Raman spectrometer. Basically, it's going to shine ultraviolet light at samples of the rock and the material around the rover, and then try to understand the minerals and the organic materials inside of those things that it's looking at, using this kind of chemistry, this kind of instrumentation called Raman spectrometry. So that's very cool. But I mean, the first powered flight test on Mars with Ingenuity is really cool. This is the first mission to actively be attempting to collect samples for return to Earth. And so a really big, thing for us when we're trying to understand whether or not we can see signs of life on Mars or anywhere else in our solar system is having the potential of bringing those samples back to Earth. We can do so much more diagnostic science in our laboratories and with our instruments here on Earth and with many different people working on those samples than what we can in place on Mars. And so sample return is also a huge endeavor. It's actually part of a three mission concept. So Perseverance will be collecting samples and caching them at various places and in one large sample container as well around Mars on the surface. Another mission is going to come and pick up those samples and launch them into orbit around Mars. And then another mission will grab those samples and bring them back to Earth. And so it's a really large, complex undertaking to try to bring samples from Mars back home. But I'm really looking forward to that part of the mission as well.
All right. I know you have a whole talk prepared to go and dive into it, so I'm just going to turn it over to you. Thank you so much for all that information about Mars Perseverance. It's so exciting, and I'm a chemist. I'm like, he said ramen. He said ramen spectroscopy. I'm all there. So I actually used ramen in my particular research in the past, so that's really cool. But have at it.
Cool. Let me just do my share screen thing here. Um, can you see just the screen itself, or is it showing my presenter view? It's doing presenter view. Hold on a minute.
Oh yeah. It was in little boxes.
How does that look?
That looks better. I'll see. Yeah, that looks cool. You're good.
It looks like it's cutting off part of the slide, I think, in your.
Yeah, on mine, I'll fix that.
Okay.
I will fix that. So, but the people in the actual attendee can see your whole slide. So let me go ahead and I will work on this while you.
Okay. Yeah, no worries. So I didn't quite know exactly where everyone stands with their knowledge of astrobiology. Astrobiology really is our quest to understand the nature of life. And a big part of that is really understanding our world, understanding how life came to be here on Earth. And we're at a really special time right now in the history of our species. It's really just almost a century since we discovered that other galaxies exist. We're just now starting to understand more about our place in the cosmos. That not only is our world one of many around a single star, but our star is one of a great many in a galaxy, and that galaxy is one of a great many. And that really opens up the potential for how many worlds could be out there. Since I was born, I mean, when I was born, we didn't have any evidence of other worlds around other stars, what we call exoplanets. And now we have over 4,400 confirmed exoplanets that we've discovered since 1995. And that number continues to grow all the time. We're building better and better telescopes to study those worlds around other stars. And based on those worlds alone, we think that there could be something like maybe 400 billion up to a trillion planets in our galaxy alone. And so that really starts raising the potential for other worlds out there to be populated, to have life, for us to study and for us to come to know. And the realm of astrobiology itself, it can be argued as it's fairly old. It's been with humans for a very long time, this question of are we alone? Are there other tribes across the river? Is there somebody in this other land that I've heard of in stories? Or is there something living in these worlds around other stars? But astrobiology itself as a scientific term is actually fairly new. And it comes along with our understanding of our place in the cosmos and our explorations. For instance, you might know that Monday, April 12th, is the 60th anniversary of the first time a human being traveled into space. So it's only been 60 years that we've been traveling into space. And it's right around that same period of time that we've been using this word astrobiology in a scientific sense to explain this idea of placing life around stars in the heavens, trying to understand whether or not we're alone. This book was the very first book with the word astrobiology in the title, and using it as a term to suggest this idea of life in the universe, from 1953. But it wasn't until much later that even NASA started using the word astrobiology. For a long time, NASA used things like xenobiology and exobiology. But then back in 1996, a research paper was published that had this famous image in it, showing what kind of looks like a little worm inside of this image, inside of some rocky materials. These rocky materials came from a meteorite called the Allen Hills meteorite, ALH 84001. It was found in the Allen Hills region of Antarctica in 1984. And this detection of what looked like potential life, not just an observation of something that looks like the shape of a living thing, but also some chemistry that suggested the potential activity of life inside of this meteorite, was a huge finding. I remember I was a kid when this happened, and I remember watching on the news President Bill Clinton at that time in 1996 coming out to a press briefing in the White House and talking about the fact that we might have found Martian life in a meteorite. Now, since that time, those claims of this being Martian life have been highly scrutinized, and I think a lot of scientists think that this was not definitive signs of life. It turns out a lot of the things that were proposed as being signs of life can also form abiotically or without the presence of life. But there's still some who think that this was a life detection. But it really did launch for NASA the word astrobiology in their parlance. And so now we have astrobiology as this study of the origins and evolution, the distribution of life in the universe. And like I said earlier, for me, that really is just our quest to understand the nature of life. And so I'll talk here just for a minute about some of the things that we're doing right now in astrobiology before really kind of focusing in then on Mars and some of the other things I've been doing in my own career. So first off, one big part of astrobiology right now is trying to understand origins, trying to understand where we've come from to be here right now. You know, we still don't know how life first started on Earth, and there's a very good chance that we'll never know exactly how life first started on Earth. A large reason for that is that the earliest rocks that were forming at the surface of our planet have long since been destroyed by planetary processes, by subduction of tectonic plates, by volcanism, by erosion. And so those earliest rocks that might have had the earliest signs of life are likely mostly gone. We do have some very old fragments of rock, fragments of minerals from those very old rocks that some scientists are using. And based on those, we have a rough idea that something like 3.8 to 4 billion years ago, life was around on Earth. But we don't have necessarily like definitive hard evidence of when life first started. Many of us would just say roughly 4 billion years ago, life started on Earth. But even then, we still need to know, how did it happen? What chemical processes were occurring to allow non-life to become life? And that's a really huge question for a lot of us in astrobiology. And there's a whole realm of researchers right now who are studying this question, not just how does life start on Earth, or did it start on Earth, but also how could life start in other environments and other worlds? Is a really big realm of astrobiology right now, this origins of life kind of research. There's also a lot of research from astrobiologists who are involved in planetary science and in geology to try to understand how life and our geosphere, our world, have evolved together, how the biosphere and the rocks of the planet have changed through time together. For instance, looking at mineralogical evolution of our world, we see like on Mars right now, we know something like maybe 300 minerals for sure from Mars, but we have well over 3,000 here on Earth. And a large reason for that is the actions of life. Life changes its environment around it. Life altered our atmosphere long ago. And the early Earth, there wasn't much oxygen in our atmosphere. It wasn't until about 2.4 to 2.7 billion years ago that the activities of life, specifically photosynthesis, started producing enough oxygen to oxygenate our atmosphere. And so we look at things around our planet, we see the signs of life everywhere, not just living things and molecules coming from them, but also how they have altered our planet altogether. Our world really is a living thing. And then we also in astrobiology consider, that this huge diversity of what life does on our planet. A lot of times when you hear people talking about astrobiology, they're usually talking about microbes. A lot of people think if we find life in other worlds, it's most likely going to be microbial, especially since the history of life here on Earth was primarily microbial. We didn't have animals and plants and fungi until just a few 100 million years ago. Before that, all of life on Earth was microbial for a very long time. And so a lot of people argue because of that maybe life tends to be microbial elsewhere. I don't personally agree with that argument. I don't think we can use the time frame of life on Earth to necessarily tell us the time frame for life on other worlds. Maybe some worlds never go beyond microbial life, whereas maybe some worlds get to larger animal-like or plant-like kind of life much sooner. And maybe even other kinds of life that we have no analogy for, no analog for here on Earth. But also for myself, since I started off in biology, I really thought at first I would be like a wildlife biologist. I really wanted to like go hang out in like the savannah in Africa, or in like the rainforest in the Amazon in South America, and like catalog organisms and try to understand just this huge biodiversity we have on our planet. And since so, even in my career, that eventually led me into microbiology and evolutionary biology, into astrophysics and planetary science, and the other things I've done, I'm still very interested in how life functions on our planet in general, and whether or not some of these things we see, like birds flying and the activity of swarming insects and things like this, and some of these other behaviors we see on our planet, if we'll see a lot of that in alien life as well. And then, of course, a big part of astrobiology right now is trying to figure out, could there have ever been life elsewhere in our solar system? There are a few key worlds. I've highlighted just a few of them here, and this is not to scale, but worlds like Venus and Mars, Titan, Enceladus, and Europa, some of the moons of our solar system as well, are places that we've been considering for some time, whether or not they might have had life or even currently have living things, living alien beings on them. For instance, you might have heard a lot lately about Venus because of some news that came out last fall. So Venus is closer to the sun than we are. It very much is our sister world. In this image here on the left, you can see a visible light image blended with UV, looking at the clouds of Venus. Venus is a world obscured by clouds. It has a very thick atmosphere. And you can't anywhere with the human eye look down through those clouds. It's everywhere, just very thick. But if we use radar, like on this image to the right, then we can see the actual surface of Venus. And this image, you've probably seen this image before on the internet, showing Venus. This is a radar image, and so it's not showing what Venus would look like with our eyes if we could see through those clouds. What you're actually seeing is the topography. So where it's really bright and a lighter coloration here, that's where the radar signal is showing us the rocks are really jagged. They have a lot of texture. And where you see the darker areas, those areas are usually flatter and smoother materials. And so those are more like recent volcanic eruptions where lava has come out and kind of made a nice flat surface. But we see a lot of interesting terrain all over the surface of Venus. But Venus is not a place for life as we know it to thrive, at least not on the surface. The surface temperature of Venus is just shy of 900 degrees Fahrenheit. So super hot. You could bake a freezer pizza in like 8 seconds on the surface of Venus. And the atmosphere is also 92 times the surface pressure that we have here at the Earth. So if you were on the surface of Venus, not only would it be excruciatingly baking hot, it would also feel like you're at the bottom of the ocean with the pressure pushing on you. It rains sulfuric acid in the lower atmosphere of Venus, but the pressure and temperature are so high that sulfuric acid re-evaporates and goes back up. And so we don't think any kind of life as we know it is thriving on the surface of Venus. But for quite some time, scientists have wondered, could living things still exist in the atmosphere of Venus? Could Venus have had a biosphere that eventually migrated up into its atmosphere where the conditions are a little better for life? And that was part of what led to some really big news this past fall that you might have heard of the potential detection from some telescopes here on Earth of a molecule called phosphine in the atmosphere of Venus, in the middle cloud layers of Venus. This molecule, phosphine, has been found before in other worlds. We found it in the atmospheres of Jupiter and Saturn, for instance, and it doesn't imply life in those environments because we have really good chemical models to show us how phosphine can form abiotically or without life in Jupiter and Saturn. But those same models don't work for Venus, which means that, either we don't know what's going on there is some abiotic process to form it if it's there, or it could be formed by biological activity, which happens here on Earth. So we do have phosphine here on Earth. We can make it in the laboratory without life, but when we find phosphine here on Earth, it's being formed by biological activity, by living things. Specifically, we find it in things like penguin poop and in swampy areas where life is degrading other organisms. It's giving off phosphine in these kinds of environments. And so maybe phosphine could be a potential sign of life in the Venusian atmosphere if it's there. It's even led the scientists who made this potential detection of phosphine. They wrote a recent paper proposing a putative life cycle for a living kind of biosphere in the Venusian atmosphere if it's there. And so in this image, you can kind of see here, I blew out this picture down in the lower left here. At their step 1, they have what's called endospores. Here on Earth, some creatures create spores. Fungi create spores, but also a lot of microbes will create what's called spores that encapsulates their DNA and other important materials, and then the rest of the cell can kind of die and get torn away. But those spores are very resistant to degradation from temperature and from salty environments, from light from the sun. Those spores are a way for living things to survive in really terrible environments until they find a better place to live. And that's what they're showing here is these spores in the lower atmosphere of Venus, where, again, it's raining sulfuric acid, it's super hot. But then maybe these spores could get lofted up into that region of the middle atmosphere where the temperature and pressure gets a little bit better for life as we know it. So in their image over here, they're showing that it's something like 45 to 60-ish degrees Celsius. So it's still very hot in this region, but the pressure is much closer to what we have here on Earth. And so it becomes a much more clement environment for life as we know it in this region. And so what they're showing then is those spores then vegetating, becoming full cells, creating a life cycle. And then they're actually showing here what's the condensation of water around these cells, allowing this to happen, that maybe they have a whole life cycle inside of the middle atmosphere before then forming those spores again and raining back down. And that's all very intriguing. This is what we as scientists do. We find data, we use observations, and it brings data to us. And then based on those data, we can make inferences about what's really going on in the natural world. And then based on those inferences, we can create hypotheses and models to try to explain the natural world and the natural universe around us. And so this is a very interesting hypothesis. Should that phosphine actually be there, and should it be derived from living things? But there's also some problems with that detection too. And so what you see here in this image, I'm showing 2 different radio telescopes here. The bottom one is the James Clerk Maxwell telescope in Hawaii. The top one is ALMA, or the Atacama Large Millimeter Submillimeter Array in South America. These are the telescopes they used to make that potential detection of phosphine. And so on the right here, in front of this image of Venus, you can see the data coming from these 2 telescopes. The gray one in the background is from the JCMT, and you can see where the data coming across dip in this one region right in the middle and then come back up. And then the same thing happens with ALMA. They have data coming across and then it dips down and keeps going. And what they inferred from this dip was the presence of that molecule of phosphine, that based on that dipping structure, they were suggesting that the phosphine, the bonds in the molecules of phosphine are absorbing the radio waves in this region and are causing that dip in the data. But since this was published last fall, there have been a whole bunch of other papers now coming out. Some are in support of this finding. For instance, a colleague of mine led a study using older data from an older mission to look at the chemistry of Venus. They went back and reanalyzed all of the data, and they actually found support for the presence of phosphine in data from a mission from over 40 years ago. However, there's some other people who've been looking at the data from this recent teamwork as well, and they've said that they can't find any evidence of this dip being there at all. Whereas another team says that if that dip is there, it's likely from the presence of sulfur dioxide. and not phosphine. And the sulfur dioxide should be very present in the atmosphere of Venus. And so this is an important thing that happens in science. The extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, as Carl Sagan once said, that when we have something as extraordinary as a potential for life in the atmosphere of Venus based on the finding of the molecule phosphine, which we can't explain it being there, then we also need extraordinary evidence to support that claim. And so for those who are interested in studying science or using science in your own careers in various ways, it's important to remember, the level at which we can really state specific claims and how much evidence we have to support those claims. It's one of the key factors of science is that we apply empiricism to the work that we do. And another place where in astrobiology, we are looking for some extraordinary evidence to support a potentially extraordinary claim is on Mars. Did Mars ever have life? Does Mars currently have life? We don't know. Mars is further from the sun than we are, and I personally would argue that if any other world besides the Earth had life at any point in our solar system's history, it was likely Venus. Venus was far more clement early on in our solar system's history, probably had oceans and an atmosphere like ours. But Mars is potentially a good candidate as well. We've now discovered a lot of history of water activity at the surface of Mars. We know at least there were rivers and lakes, maybe even a small ocean in the northern region of Mars. And Mars has just honestly held our fascination for a long time in trying to understand whether or not there could be alien life out there. The astronomer Percival Lowell in 1895, he wrote a book about Mars where he hypothesized that based on his observations that there was a Martian organism, a civilization of beings who were using irrigation to move water from the poles of Mars down to its equator where things were drying out. That hypothesis led the science fiction writer H.G. Wells to write the book The War of the Worlds, which in many ways kind of launched alien science fiction, at least alien sci-fi horror, this idea that aliens could be right nearby and want to attack us. And in the early parts of the 1900s, a lot of people just took it for granted. They just took it as rote that Mars had a civilization of beings that we couldn't communicate with because it was so far away. But then we started sending missions there, and we've sent lots of missions there. And as we've mentioned earlier, we just sent a recent mission there with Perseverance. If you're interested, I do highly recommend checking out this website at mars.nasa.gov. There's a map where you can follow the rover itself. And so as the days and months and years start passing by, you'll see a track of the rover as it starts to move around here inside of this region of Mars called Jezero Crater. Jezero is extremely interesting for a variety of reasons. One of them being that we have signs based on orbital data. So as spacecraft orbit around Mars and look down and take pictures and study the chemistry, we have signs that this crater was once filled with water, potentially several times. There might have been several paleo lakes in the history of Jezero Crater. And in this image, if you look, there's this little valley kind of coming in from the left over here, where it kind of looks like a river valley moving out. And then you see this big fan-shaped thing that looks very much like a river delta. And so what scientists think is happening here is that there was active water flowing into the crater from this channel, and it was depositing at where it met this lake, a large delta, just like the Mississippi Delta. Most of Louisiana is actually delta materials from the Mississippi River, eroding material and taking it down to the ocean over time. And one thing we know here on Earth is where these kinds of alluvial fans and deltas are forming on Earth, they are great places for trapping signs of life from upstream inside of these outflow channels. They create great areas for preservation of ancient life. And so this might be a place for us to find the first signs of ancient life on Mars with the Perseverance rover. I also think we should give a shout out, though, to the other two missions that just arrived at Mars. It's been a really busy year for Mars. Not only did Perseverance get there and land, but the United Arab Emirates, their first mission to Mars, the HOPE spacecraft, got there. HOPE will be a really incredible climate and weather satellite, basically orbiting around Mars, learning more about the atmosphere, about the dust storms that take place on Mars. And then also the Chinese National Space Agency, they have Tianwen-1, which is now in orbit around Mars with its orbiter. But then along with the orbiter right now is a rover and lander combo that sometime, and maybe around May, is going to then also go down and land on Mars. The lander will do some scientific work, but then the rover itself will drive off of the lander and then also do some scientific work. So we have a rich history of sending robots to Mars. There's that funny joke you might have heard that Mars is the only world we know of so far that's solely inhabited by robots. And that might be true. Maybe there is no current life on Mars, and it really is just all of our robots we keep sending there. This image is showing in the top left here the rover family from NASA. So Sojourner, the Mars exploration rovers, Spirit and Opportunity, and then the size of Curiosity and Perseverance here compared to these people, just so you can have an idea of how big these spacecraft are. This thing down here in the lower left is actually a mission that I'm really looking forward to from the Japanese Aerospace Exploration Agency, or JAXA. That mission is called MMX, and I have a figure here just showing some of the upcoming missions. We have a bunch of things launching to Mars again soon. Like next year, there should be 2 more missions. And in 2024, there's at least 2 missions that are planned to go. And one of them here is MMX, this Martian Moon Explorer from the Japanese Aerospace Agency. What I find really exciting about that one is it's also a sample return mission. But unlike Perseverance, which has to cache samples and then have another spacecraft come in and pick them up and then launch them back, MMX's plan is to go to Phobos, one of Mars's 2 moons, to land and do some science, but also to collect a sample from the moon and then launch that back to Earth. Phobos and Deimos, the 2 moons of Mars, are very small moons. They have much lower gravity than even our moon does. And so launching off the surface of Phobos should be fairly simple in comparison to launching from, for instance, our moon or from the surface of Mars. And so MMX could be a really cool sample return mission as well. And so I figured rather than talking, solely about what we're looking for on Mars, one important thing we're doing in astrobiology as well is using environments here on Earth to try to figure out what we're looking for on Mars. We call these analog environments. This image is from the astrobiology comic book series or graphic history series created by the scientist and artist Aaron Gronstal. And what I like in this image, he has Peter Doran here saying that analog environments, these environments on Earth that we're using to be analogous to Mars, they all share life-threatening characteristics. And that is important, that they are environments that are life-threatening, but it's also important that we're looking for life-supporting characteristics in the environment around us, across our planet, in various kinds of environments that have at least some similarities to Mars or other worlds, for us to look for how life leaves its signature in the rock record, in the minerals, in the chemistry of the environment around it. For instance, the Atacama Desert in South America, the home of that telescope I mentioned earlier, that Atacama Large Millimeter Submillimeter Array, it's actually stationed in the driest desert on our planet. The Atacama Desert has the driest region of any desert in the world, and it's also an interesting test bed for Mars. There is a lot of life in the Atacama Desert in the soil, but it is fairly scant. There's not that much of it because there's not many nutrients around for life to thrive. Plus, it's a hostile environment, lots of sunlight, very dry. And so some areas in the Atacama have been great test beds for looking for things we might find on Mars. For instance, this image here on the left shows a place called Yungay in the Atacama Desert, and I'm comparing it here to an image from the Viking 2 lander in 1976. And you can see a similar kind of strewn field of rocks here in both of these images. Not too long ago, an astrobiologist named Dirk Schues-Makuch and his lab team did some research in this region of Yungay, looking at how organisms bounce back after a very wet season in this desert. I don't like showing lots of data in talks, but I thought this was a pretty cool figure here. So these are 6 different plots. Each of them on their x-axis is showing 3 different years, 2015, 2016, and 2017. And what you're seeing in this first one is the water content in the minerals of the soil, sampled from about 20 to 30 centimeters down. And so what you're seeing, this big bump right here on this blue figure, is showing that there was a lot of water for the Atacama Desert. It's 3% water, which is very low for most places that we know of around our own homes. But this is still really, really high for this region of the world. And then you can see it falling down to almost zero. What happened here in 2015, they had gotten to their sampling site just after a major wet year when there was actually a large amount of water for the Atacama dropping. And so they had a chance to sample over 3 years what happens as that water content starts to go away and the desert goes back to its normal way of being. And so this first one, what you're seeing is a lot of water content then going away over the next 2 years. And over here, what you're seeing is the formation of a mineral called anhydrite. This forms in very dry environments. So you're seeing not much of it, and then it starts coming back a lot because the soil is drying out again. And so what they were looking at in all of these other figures is basically showing the activity of life, the blooming of living things in the near surface and even the deep surface because of that water content. So when they had this huge wet activity, living things took off and went crazy. And then as that water activity goes away and it starts drying out, then the activity starts going way down fairly markedly. There's only one place here where we didn't see a huge decrease in their data. But for the most part, this showing how living things are basically going from, a bonanza of water and food and activity to then dying back out and kind of becoming more quiet and dormant again, waiting for the right potential. And so maybe Mars, as it was drying out and losing some of that water activity, maybe organisms on Mars were finding ways to thrive in the slowly drying environment. Maybe Mars had adaptations for those drying environments that has allowed life to persist to today, or at least allowed life to leave a record for us to find on Mars. Another interesting place here on Earth for us to look at are acid mine drainage systems, areas where our activity in mining is causing the release of heavy metals and acidity and lots of iron. So the reason that Mars is red is because of iron, because of the rusting of iron on the surface of Mars. And we see this happen a lot in mining environments as well. This is the Rio Tinto environment in Spain. Because of mining activities in this region, you can see the blood red color of the fluid here from the presence of iron oxides coming off of metals in the mining process. This is a kind of an ugly looking image, but it's showing what happens in mining sites even thousands of years old from our activity mining metals in the subsurface. When oxygen and water are allowed to meet with the metals in the subsurface that we're mining, it can create sulfuric acid, which then continues kind of eating away at other stuff. That leads to heavy metals, and this even says fish mortality. These acid mine drainage environments are pretty terrible for life as we know it. At least, things that we think of like us, but they're actually great environments for microbes that thrive in highly acidic systems with lots of metals, things that might be relevant to Mars. And we actually have lots of these acid mine drainage sites around the US to study. And so that's another place for us to go and look at the kinds of organisms that might have been thriving in Mars, especially as it was drying up and losing some of that fluid. Another place, this is a picture of me from some years ago up in the Arctic, looking at a region where you can see the red staining of rock here around me. This red staining of these materials is also caused by the activity of this basically this leaching of the rock, forming iron oxides. And so these are data that I haven't published yet, just showing some of the kinds of minerals that are forming here. This yellow mineral, this yellow color here for jarosite, is actually an interesting one for Mars. It's been argued that jarosite on Mars could be a sign of biological activity during the weathering of Martian rock. And over here on the right-hand side, you see some electron microscope images I took. One of them is showing the etching of minerals that have really interesting geometric features, similar to how life etches minerals. You can also see these filaments that are encrusted in these iron oxides and other metals, very similar to how living things on Earth create filaments in these kinds of environments. And so we're using these kinds of signs of potential diagnostic signatures of life here on Earth in very remote environments to look for potential signs of life out there. And I think for time, since it is 12:44 my time here, I'm going to skip a few other things and jump ahead towards the end. A big thing for a lot of us is will we ever actually send humans to Mars? Will humans ever go there and do some of our research on the surface of Mars? And honestly, for me in general, I just want to see humans go there. I've been very lucky in my career. I've had a chance to be an analog astronaut, to go to places on Earth, to see what it would be like to be living on the surface of Mars, at least to some degree. This is called the Mars Desert Research Station, for instance. That's where I was an analog astronaut. It's out in Utah, in a very Martian-like region of the desert of Utah. We have this Mars habitat that kind of looks like a rocket standing on its edge. There's a large science area, a greenhouse, an observatory, and people can go to this place and go on missions for 2 weeks or 4 weeks at a time and basically pretend like they're on Mars and kind of work together to see what it'd be like collecting samples and doing science, or even creating music or artwork, or trying to do business or law on Mars. And we now have lots of these kinds of research bases all around the world. There's one in Hawaii. There's a couple up in the high Arctic. We have new ones forming all the time in various deserts in Oman and Israel. A lot of people are getting interested in what it might be like for humans to go to Mars. I'm also fortunate that I'm involved with an undergraduate student competition called the University Rover Challenge, where college students from around the world can get together in teams. They design and then build Mars rovers. And then most years when we're not having a pandemic, they bring them out to Utah to that Mars Desert Research Station, and we give them a competition in a Mars environment. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic, we had to cancel last year, and we're canceling this year as well, likely going to do a remote competition instead, so that the students can still use their rovers, even if doing it in their own homes, in their own countries. But it's been very cool to see these students building these Mars rovers and testing them. It kind of goes to a lot of what I've wanted in my own life. Like, will we ever send humans to Mars? And if so, I'd love to be one of those who goes. I also wouldn't mind having a way to get back home. But there is a chance that some of the first humans going to Mars might be long-term residents who will be staying there and doing research on Mars. And so I think I might just end it there. One more thing I wanted to talk about, if I can share my screen here again. No, it's not letting me. That's unfortunate. One thing I wanted to mention this weekend, tomorrow, is the celebration for something called Yuri's Night. So I mentioned it's only been 60 years since humans first stepped foot into space and first traveled into space. Tomorrow is a world space party called Yuri's Night. It's actually the 20th anniversary of this space party as well. And you can tune in online for free on YouTube and watch a live stream. There's going to be a bunch of really cool people. Richard Branson will be there. Cyan Proctor, who was just announced, is going to become the first civilian astronaut pilot here sometime in the coming year. A bunch of really incredible people from around the space exploration realm are going to be in this live stream talking about space, about humans going into space and what that means for us. There's also going to be a backstage area where people can pay for a ticket to go backstage. It's $15 for a ticket, but I can give you a code here in the chat then to save $5 off to go backstage and talk with not just the people who are presenting in the live stream, but also all of these other people who are interested in space exploration. So if any of you are interested in space exploration, it's going to be a very cool event as well. So I highly recommend checking that out if you can too.
Well, this is pretty exciting. I think at this time we can open up for questions. If anybody has any questions, you can pop them over here in the chat. I know I have all kinds of questions. All right. While we're waiting on people to kind of process everything and post some questions, what are the biggest challenges associated with having humans on Mars?
Oh gosh, so many. Mars is not a place that will be friendly to human life, at least not right now. So going to Mars is going to require that we really engineer our habitats, our spacesuits, the way that we do things to try to protect the people who are going. For instance, the radiation environment on the way to Mars and on the surface of Mars is much higher than here at Earth. So all of us, and don't be alarmed, this is a natural process. all of us receive some level of radiation from the environment around us each year. So rocks around you are there's radioactive material in those rocks. It's breaking down and radiation is hitting you. There are cosmic rays coming down through our atmosphere. Some of them actually do get to us. There are radioactive things in our food, but not much. And so we have a lower level of radiation here at the surface of Earth, and we've evolved over time to deal with this radiation. And so our bodies are accustomed to living in the radiation environment at the surface of our planet where it is right now. But on the surface of Mars, that radiation environment is a lot higher. And so humans who travel to Mars, even if they just go on, a short journey there and spend maybe a year and a half on the surface and then come back, even during that trip, they'll still receive a lot more radiation than they would have had on the International Space Station or here down on the surface of the Earth. It'd be a lot. And so we need to find ways to mitigate that radiation, to protect the astronauts. Some things to do that with can be shielding of various kinds on the spacecraft on the way there. There's also the proposals of if we're going to start building habitats on the surface of Mars, to do things like taking the regolith, the soil of Mars, and dumping that on top of the habitats to create a natural barrier to radiation, or even looking for things like lava tubes. When lava flows here on Earth from volcanoes, sometimes it can leave behind these long cave-like tubes, and they're a lot of fun to go explore, but they also present potential environments on Mars, if we find some, that we can actually put our habitats inside of those caves. That way we have natural protection from the radiation environment. So that's a big thing. Also, just producing enough food, enough water for us to live is a huge undertaking. You might know that one of the cool things about Perseverance, the new rover we just sent to Mars, it has a test instrument on board called MOXIE. This instrument, its job is basically to use something called electrochemistry to take the carbon dioxide from the Martian atmosphere and to split that carbon dioxide into carbon monoxide and to oxygen. Now, the carbon monoxide isn't useful. That can just blow away. But if we can take the CO2 out of the Martian atmosphere and create oxygen, we can then use that oxygen to breathe, and we can use it for rocket fuel. And so both of those things are really important for getting humans to Mars. And so MOXIE is a really important in situ test of this kind of technology to allow us to generate oxygen at the surface of Mars. And certainly we're going to need a lot more people thinking, how do we engineer habitats to allow humans to live well on Mars? How do we grow food on Mars? Not too long ago, I was part of a webinar through the group called Explore Mars. We had a bunch of experts on to talk about how we might grow plants on Mars, how we might make sure that humans are enjoying the food that they eat on Mars. Will humans be growing lab-based meats, like lab-based beef or lab-based fish on Mars? And so there's a lot we don't know yet, but we're still learning a lot as we go along the way of getting humans eventually to Mars.
Well, thank you for that, thorough answer there. We have a couple questions in the chat. It looks like Jonathan asks, how will the Mars samples be delivered to Earth by the robot Perseverance?
Yeah, very good question, Jonathan. So first off, Perseverance will not be returning to Earth. So the samples it's collecting right now are going to be cached. They're going to be stored. And so it has a bunch of these little sample tubes on board. They're about this size. And those sample tubes, it has a drill that can basically put the samples in the tube and close the tube. And then these tubes will be dropped either together in small bunches or will be placed inside of a larger sample cache container that will then drop to the surface as well. And we're likely going to do both things just to ensure that if something goes wrong, that the samples don't get stuck on board the rover, so that we have some samples that are stored in various places as well. We're then going to send another mission to pick up those samples and then launch them into orbit of Mars. And then we're going to have another mission that's going to pick up those samples in the orbit of Mars and then bring them back to Earth. And then we have to worry about transporting them down to the surface. There's actually a whole lot of people right now who are gearing up to be prepared for what we do with those samples when we bring them back. We have to be very careful. If there is Martian life in any of those samples, can it harm life on Earth? We don't know. And so it's important to be prepared for very, very stringent procedures in bringing those samples down from orbit of our world down to the surface and into our laboratory for testing. And so there's certainly going to be a lot of steps along the way to ensure those samples are preserved and aren't contaminated, but also to ensure that they can't contaminate us either.
Very cool. Yeah, I imagine that's a whole genre of sci-fi scary movies is
Yeah.
contaminants and viruses.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the Andromeda Strain by Michael Crichton is a great short read that was turned into a movie in the 70s where he kind of proposed this idea of what happens if alien viruses or alien bacteria are raining down on Earth, or we get a sample of a meteorite or a sample from Mars, and it has living things that can kill us inside of it.
Yeah, it's scary stuff. Aziza has a question. She says, "Why aren't there any rovers being sent to Venus if it is more likely to have life?"
Ooh, very fun question, Aziza. So we actually have a lot of proposals for missions to Venus. Venus hasn't been as attractive for a lot of the people who fund missions. So we've had lots of missions get funded to go to Mars, but not many to Venus, which is unfortunate because there's still a lot of things we want to know about Venus. But like I said, the surface of Venus is extremely hot and the pressure is very high. And so Venus is not a place that's very friendly, not even just for life as we know it. The surface of Venus is actually very unfriendly for robots as well. We've only had a few missions successfully land at the surface of Venus and take data. The longest lived of those are the Venera 13 and Venera 14 spacecraft from the Soviet Union from back in the 1970s. These two spacecraft, the longest lived was Venera 13. It lived 127 minutes on the surface, so just over 2 hours before that heat and that pressure basically baked the robot and destroyed it. There have been some really cool proposals, though, more recently for how we might get around that a little bit. For instance, there was a really cool concept design out of NASA for building an analog robot. So one that uses less computer chips and less digital hardware that can be destroyed by the high temperature, and instead uses more things like gears and cogs and wheels and stuff like that to try. It basically like a steampunk rover to try to better survive that temperature. But like I mentioned, if this phosphine does exist in Venus, and if it maybe is being formed by life, then maybe we don't have to land to find it. And so there are currently two concept designs that sometime this year will be decided by NASA if either of them or both might get selected for funding to actually go to Venus. And one of them will actually be a mission that could go down through the atmosphere and could actually collect data needed in the middle atmosphere to see if there's any potential signs of life there. And then since this announcement last fall, others have been now proposing new ideas for sending spacecraft to Venus. The Russian space agency, Roscosmos, they've now said that they want to send a mission now again to Venus. And also a private group called Rocket Lab. They've been planning a Venus mission for some time that they might launch in, like, I think 2024 is the current window. That they've said now they could put an instrument on board to look for that phosphine if it's there. And so that could be a really important mission as well. So there still are some things that we're hoping go to Venus. It just hasn't been as attractive for funding agencies, not as much as Mars has, unfortunately.
Well, very cool answer. Yeah, funding. That's always the issue, huh?
Yeah, exactly.
Ryan has a question. When people arrive on Mars, where will their rocket ships go?
Oh, cool. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so will we leave part of the ship in orbit and leaving behind like a large orbiting space station and then send part of the spacecraft down to the surface, or will the whole thing land? If you've been watching, for instance, with SpaceX, they've been doing tests of their upcoming Starship spacecraft. And with each of these tests, they show vertical takeoff, and they've been showing this belly flop maneuver into what should be vertical landing. They had one, semi-successful landing that then exploded at the launch pad. They're still working on testing all of the systems, but maybe something like Starship will go to Mars, and the whole spacecraft will basically land at the surface, and that spacecraft will then become the house, the habitat for the humans who are then exploring Mars. And then maybe it will launch back to Earth later, or maybe we'll send some Starship style spacecraft to Mars with the sole intention of leaving them there as habitats. And maybe we'll send other spacecraft separately that are intended as return spacecraft for coming back to Earth. There's a lot of potential yet in how we really design these human missions to Mars.
Cool. Aziza has another question. Can Earth's atmosphere destroy I'm assuming the Mars samples?
Yeah, that's a good question. So that's part of why they're being stored inside of those sample tubes. I mentioned the radiation environment at Mars, for instance. So the sample tube will help keep the sample from being destroyed by radiation. It'll keep the chemistry of the Martian surface out. For instance, there are things at the surface of Mars called perchlorate salts that could destroy organic materials in the samples. And so by having them stored inside of these sample tubes, it protects them while they're waiting at the surface of Mars for return. It also protects them from the space environment during the return to Earth. And then it should also protect them when we bring them back down to Earth. Now, the big question is, how are we going to bring them back down to Earth? And we actually don't have a full structure for that yet. So I mentioned this three-tiered mission. The mission that goes and picks them up from orbit of Mars and comes back to Earth, it might have a system on board that has a container holding the samples that is intended to drop down to Earth safely and land somewhere that we can then collect those samples. Or there might even be yet another step of the mission that has to safely collect the samples from the return vehicle and bring them to Earth. We're still several years, many years away from this happening. And so we don't have the full structure yet of how that's going to look yet in place.
All right. I think we have time for one more question. Anna asks, if the samples from Mars are possibly dangerous, then would they go to a biosafety lab for?
Yes. Not even just that. We're going to create. So the idea right now is to create a special lab with the highest level of biosafety to ensure that if there is a potentially dangerous pathogen or some organism inside of the sample that could harm Earth life, that it won't get out. And so what she's mentioning here, that this BSL level, different labs that work with potentially dangerous organisms and potentially dangerous substances on our planet, they have different levels of safety that they're using. And with returning these samples from Mars, with us not knowing if there's life in those samples that could harm us, and also wanting to ensure that our life doesn't harm the sample or contaminate the sample, it's actually really hard to get rid of Earth life. Life on Earth is pernicious. It does not want to leave anything. And so if you've ever seen spacecraft being assembled in laboratories from NASA and other groups, you've probably seen some of these things occurring where they have these clean labs where people are wearing these white suits with respirators sometimes, and everything's very clean. They're wearing gloves. There's a bunch of like airflow around them. Even with our cleanest clean labs here on Earth, there's almost still invariably some number of cells that are getting onto things. And so to really study these Mars samples, we're going to have to be really, really, really careful to make sure that they can't harm us and that we don't contaminate them. And so it will be a special kind of laboratory used to ensure the cleanliness and safety of these samples as they're then being preserved in various ways, chopped up in various ways, and used for various kinds of analyses. And then some of them very likely eventually, once we feel sure that they're not going to harm us, we'll eventually make it then into various research labs around the world. But I think the plan right now is to have a single laboratory for analyzing these samples at first when they arrive.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Graham, for swinging by, giving us a little talk about all of the exciting things of life outside of Earth. Please do check out, do you have any other websites that you want to talk about where they can find you if they have any interest in the future?
Yeah, I'll type it in the chat here. My website is cosmobiota.com. It was an accident that I started going by The Cosmobiologist online, but I ran with it. And so cosmobiota.com is my website. You can find access there to all of my social media handles for how to get a hold of me if you want to send me an email if you have questions. I'm always happy to chat about the potential for alien life. I also talk a lot with young students about careers, not just in astrobiology, but in space exploration and in various realms in the sciences as well. Um, there is still 6 days left in applying for our remote online internship through Blue Marble Space Institute of Science. So every summer, my organization, we bring on interns to work on remote projects that are available from various scientists in our organization. These are open to anyone attending college or university or those who've finished an associate's or bachelor's degree already. So that's also worth checking out. You can find that at bmsis.org, which I dropped in the chat as well.
Well, that's super exciting. I'll be certain to pass that along to my students. And please, guys, we are recording this. So if you didn't get a chance to see the beginning, that's okay. We'll be posting it at the Southwest website. So thank you again, Dr. Lau, Dr. Graham Lau. It's been awesome seeing you again. And,
Yeah.
Guys, shoot him any kind of questions that you might have on is it cosmobiologist on the Twitter, as the kids call it.
Yeah, at Cosmobiologist on Twitter.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for joining us for the Natural Sciences Seminar, and I guess we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Bye all.
Bye.